It's believed Cottingham killed up to 100 women between the early 1960s and 1980 when he was taken off the streets.
On this episode, we will discuss Richard Cottingham, the torso killer, aka the Times Square killer, and his many victims. We will also deep dive into how he was arrested, a fascinating tale of chances, almost missed opportunities. A killer might have slipped away, and the cops could still be looking for him to this day. You're listening to The Crime Room, a true crime podcast about how homicide detectives catch bad guys. I'm Jolene Grace.
And I'm Branden.
Well, hello and welcome back. Richard Cottingham turned out to be a very slippery guy, deceiving.
Yes, he was.
Secretive, smarter than he looked. He evaded cops for, nearly 13 years?
Yes.
And in the wake of the 13 years, he killed anywhere up to 100 women, if we believe his own words. Allegedly, he said anywhere between 80 to 100. In fact, he says, I don't really remember, very casually.
And I'm still not convinced of that number, because like we mentioned, there's only been 12 connected cases to Richard Cottingham. And let's go over his official charges. He was convicted of 5 total murders, 2 in New Jersey and 3 in New York. He was also charged with multiple other lesser included charges such as kidnapping and sexual assaults. There were actually 4 surviving victims who testified against Cottingham. Surprisingly, he was only convicted of 3 out of 4 of the abduction rape survivor cases, and he was acquitted in the last one.
So not only was he smarter than he looked, but there was a little bit of luck on his side, being acquitted in that last trial. It doesn't matter. He's still, serving a lifetime in prison. He is 75 years old, and according to what we know lastly of him, he is bedridden. He refuses to speak about his crimes, and he is still denying, even to this day, some of the murders that they have successfully linked to him through DNA.
And Cottingham has been linked to dozens of other cold cases that are still unsolved.
Yeah, and it's strange how he's claiming that he has this 80 to 100 number, but then he goes ahead and denies cases that are linked to him. Not enough to convict him of anything or to move forward, but then he's denying these victims, which is very counterproductive to his claim.
So police officers who are now looking through the files, the cold case files, who went back and retested whether it's DNA or other physical evidence, they went and spoke to him several times. They came out those interviews and they said Richard Cottingham is cagey about his crimes. And in other serial killers we've seen that once they're caught, once the mask is kind of pulled down, they're happy to talk about their crimes, to even embellish their crimes. They just go in detail of what they've done, almost reliving their crimes. But now it's even better. They have audience.
Right, exactly. As you mentioned, many of the, more infamous serial killers such as Ted Bundy and Ed Kemper.
BTK killer apparently couldn't shut him up. He spoke for 18 hours straight.
Yeah, I suppose they go these years and decades without being caught, and they don't tell anybody. And after they're caught, they're actually convicted, and they're life in sentences, or they're on death row, and then now all of a sudden they're coming out with everything, and you can't get them to stop talking about it. And it does appear, as you mentioned, that they're almost bragging in a sense, saying, I did
absolutely.
This. This is what I did. This is my work. And you can go and find it
legacy.
Here. Yeah, absolutely. And he's not like other serial killers in that aspect. Whereas he's more, as you mentioned, caged. He doesn't speak about it. He has this number that he claims, but then he doesn't agree or accept these other cases that actually have some connection to him.
As a law enforcement official, you have pursued many suspects. You've interviewed them almost on a daily basis in your job. I'm curious, and I think our listeners are curious as well, if you can tell us more about what goes into interviewing uncooperative suspect. Not a suspect who says, I don't want to talk to you, I want a lawyer. Now, that's a completely different ballgame. I understand that. A suspect who says, all right, I'll talk. But you can tell he's holding or she's holding back, and it almost feels like they're stringing you along. What can you do, if anything? Are there any techniques?
Well, the goal in that situation, it depends on the person you're dealing with. Each individual is different, and they have different, pain points in which that you'll start talking to them, and you'll start realizing which subject they don't want to talk about or what they're avoiding. But in this situation, this is somebody who either believes by talking to us they will look innocent, so they're talking to us, giving us information, not knowing that even though they're not giving us what they believe to be crucial information, they're giving us information such as where they were, who would be with them, and often you will see gaps. And when you start talking to them about these gaps, they'll start going off topic or start talking about something else. So the main technique is to keep them talking about that incident, about that day, or something related to it, because eventually they will slip up. They will say something they weren't supposed to, or something that maybe they've changed earlier, now it's the right or accurate thing, and they're just becoming confused with themselves, and eventually they fall into a trap.
So how important is, during interviews such as the one we are describing, watching and understanding nonverbal cues?
Nonverbal clues are extremely important, and research has indicated that it's more important than what is being said. So if you're talking to somebody and they're just looking away while they're talking to you, or you get a feeling that, hey, he's not telling you the truth, then you dig further into what they're saying. So if there are key indications such as hiding their body or rising their knee up and down underneath the table, or hiding their hands and fiddling with them underneath the desk in which you're speaking to them. So what you want to do is you want to create an open atmosphere. They know they're being recorded. It's an uncomfortable situation for both people who are innocent and people who are witnesses and those who are guilty. It's uncomfortable for all of them because they've typically have never been there before, unless they are hardened criminal. So you want to make it so that they're unable to retreat or hide. So you want to make an open atmosphere where you're speaking to them, probably without a desk or a table between you guys, and really just start talking to them. And once you see these nonverbal clues, you kind of keen in on them. All right, he doesn't want to talk about X. Before I will bring up X, I will let him commit to a story. So if I feel he's lying about something or something doesn't make sense, I don't bring it up right away. You kind of keep in the back of your head. You don't write it down either, because that will alert them. You just keep in the back of your head and you let them finish their story. Because the rest of their story may lock them into something else, kind of conflicting to what you're about to ask them.
Okay. Those are all exceptional tips and tricks. And thank you for lifting the mask so we can see what's in the kitchen.
Oh.
Let's put a pause about talking about Richard Cottingham, the torso killer, aka the Times Square killer. I would like to shift the conversation about his victims, because there were many. And the details about the crime scenes that once cops could discuss and talk about, they were graphic, they were bloody, they were violent. Who was his first victim?
His first victim was Nancy Vogel. She was 29 years old, and she was a married mother of 2. She was killed October 28th, 1967. She was found strangled in the passenger seat of her car under a blanket in New Jersey. She was last seen 3 days before, and that's when she was playing bingo at church.
So a completely innocent woman.
Right, and before we go into the details, that one remained unsolved until Cottingham actually confessed. So Mrs. Vogel was unsolved until he was incarcerated and confessed to the crime.
Well, from my research about serial killers, I know that the first one always stays with them. So I wonder, he didn't confess to any other murders, any other women. He's alluded to 80 to 100 victims, but he confessed to her.
To Nancy, yeah.
To Nancy, yeah.
You make a good case for that being his actual first victim because...
Special.
Yeah, something special to him. Something that really, once he hit that level, it's clear that he couldn't stop. So that's... Nancy's potentially was the victim that really set him off. That he was like, okay, I can do this. I have done it. It felt good. Let's keep going. So the next known victim is actually not for maybe 6 months later. So it appears that he may have committed the act and kind of relived the moment or retreated to see if he was going to get caught or if any heat was picked up on him with the police. Dianne Cusick. She was 23 years old. She was killed February 15th, 1968. She was raped, beaten, and strangled, also in the back seat of her car. However, this time in New York.
Found her Plymouth Valiant abandoned in a parking lot. And when her father opened the back door, he found his daughter. She had adhesive tape covering her mouth, and he removed that, and she was dead.
Again, he was not charged until DNA linked him. And this is, of course, one of the cases which is to be one of the oldest DNA cases linking an offender. And we have an article on thecrimeroom.com if you would like to check it out.
Her father actually discovered Diana in the back of her car.
Oh, that's awful.
And he was the one who removed the tape from her mouth, checked for pulse, and then phoned the cops and said, she's gone. Years later, it was discovered that Cottingham was able to kidnap his victims by dressing up as a security guard.
Richard Cottingham used the guise of being store security, possibly policeman, and he would confront people coming out of the mall.
And of course, these are good people.
Yeah, right, of course.
They are worried what society will think about him. They see a man in uniform, an authority, so they went along with it, probably without, a squeak, a peep. They just went along. And that's how he was able to get them to their cars or whatever to commit these heinous crimes.
Right, so he would deploy a tactic which would work on normal citizens of society and lure them into a spot willingly into a spot until it's too late for them to leave. Something happens. Maybe he would use handcuffs at that time or something to restrain them.
Yeah.
All right, the next victim is his youngest known victim, Jacqueline Harp. She was found July 17th, 1968. She was 13 years old, which is considerably different than the 29-year-old of his first official victim.
Or the 23-year-old.
Or the 23, yes. It's definitely a variety in ages. She was randomly ambushed when she was walking back from band practice in New Jersey. They believe she was strangled by a leather flap. And let's just get more into detail about the age discrepancies of these.
Well, at this point, July 17, 1968, what jumps out at me is the fact that he's been married for less than a month, or a little over a month.
Right, that's very interesting.
Right. So he gets married, newlywed, should be in the honeymoon phase.
Right.
He should be on his honeymoon, really. But yet he's out there killing, and not only is he killing, but he's killing a child.
A 13-year-old.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just... And it's crazy to think of this facade that he could be putting towards his wife and this kind of fake person that he is, and how she believes he's a good person. She believes that he's not doing these things.
I think that marriage was doomed right from the beginning.
Yeah.
I think his wife realized that she's made a mistake because she wanted to divorce him. Maybe not so early, maybe not a month after she married him, but pretty soon after. I mean, it took several years and a couple of kids, but she knew something was up.
And as you may know, sometimes victims in domestic violence will have a child with the offender in attempts to alleviate the pain or think, oh, he will change or things will be different once we have kids. And once you have a kid with this person, it's really tough and difficult to leave. And as we mentioned, he has control of the financial situations. Back in the 1970s, they didn't have as much support for
shelters,
resources for those in domestic violence.
It was a different society.
Right, absolutely. So
there were a lot of women and men stuck in hard relationships, and
so even if there were early signs, or maybe she was being abused early, it may have been too difficult for her to leave.
She kept it in the home.
At that time, yes.
All right, who's our next victim?
Irene Blassie. She vanished April 7th, 1969. She was an 18-year-old girl, and she was found face down in 4 feet of water, and she was also strangled with a wire cord or potentially her crucifix that she was wearing when she was abducted. And then Denise Velasquez, she was abducted July 14th, 1969. She was 15 years old. She was also abducted while walking home from a friend's house. She was found the next day in the cemetery, and she was strangled with a cord chain or her crucifix as well.
So we're on the cusp of leaving the 60s behind and entering the 70s. And what struck me as we go down the list of his victims is that from 67 until 69, all the women, men, children are really part of suburbia. It seems like they were on their way to go somewhere, either shopping or just on a walk, coming back from an event or whatnot. But something happens, and in the 70s, Richard Cottingham discovers a type that is very convenient. A type of woman that he can kill, make disappear, and no one will miss.
Cottingham's hunting grounds was Times Square right here in the heart of New York City. Back in the 70s, it was jammed with sex clubs and seedy motels. Cottingham preyed on young prostitutes, luring them to motels where he mutilated and murdered them.
And that will be the reason why he stayed under the radar for as long as he did, and why I think the number 80 to 100 might be true. There might be a lot more Jane Does than we suspect. Tell us why.
Well, first, let's get into the next known victims. It was actually 2, and these 2 were actually abducted as well. So after these, there was a type that he went for. But these 2 was a double abduction rape, which happened August 9th, 1974. And that's 5 years after. So his next known victims from Denise was 5 years later. So there was definitely opportunities for him to have victims within these time frames.
I mean, yeah, look at in the 60s, the 67, the 68, he killed, and then again in 68, he has another murder, and then 2 more murders in 69. I mean, was he really able to not kill for 5 years?
The only possibility,
I don't think so.
The only possibility I'm thinking is children. He had children, and maybe some sense of him changed.
I don't think so.
I don't think so either. I'm just saying if what we had on paper is what happened, then potentially his kids could have altered what he did, or maybe he didn't have time to. I do not think so. I agree. I do believe that there are many more victims in between that time.
Cooling period of 5 years. He seems very impulsive, irrational at times, explosive. Something ticked him off in those 5 years, and there are Jane Does out there, in my opinion.
Right.
He learned how to bury the bodies too good.
Yeah, or
so good he forgot about it.
or he left them somewhere. So those two victims were Lorraine Kelly and Mary Ann Pryor. So Lorraine was 16 and Mary was 17. They were also hitchhiking to go to the mall. Cottingham later confessed to the police about killing them. So they were unable to link any information to Cottingham until after speaking with him. So our next victim is Marion Carr. She was an X-ray technician. She was killed December 15th, 1977. And she was 26 years old, which again goes into his variety of ages or victims that he would go for. And he didn't really have a
type
other than female.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't have a certain age bracket. It was a pretty distributed age bracket.
Tall, short, blonde, brunette, whatever was available to him, and he can snatch or coerce to go with him.
Right.
He did, and it's important to point out that the 75-year-old Richard Cottingham that we see from, sitting in prison or being in a hospital bed is worlds apart from Richard Cottingham in his 20s and his 30s. I mean, he was described as very powerful, very strong, aggressive, and domineering. So killing those two girls, you always wonder, or at least I wonder, how come one didn't run? While he was busy with the other and whatnot. And then I think, my gosh, he was just scary.
Right. It's tough to look at somebody now
Mm-hmm.
and remember who they were.
Mm-hmm.
Because, yes, right now he couldn't do any of this stuff. But as you mentioned, back when he was younger, he was able to, unfortunately, accomplish these,
Mm-hmm.
or his objectives. And going back to Marianne, she was abducted from her apartment where Cottingham previously lived with his wife. She was beaten and strangled in the parking lot of Quality Inn Motel in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey. She had marks around her wrists, ankles, which were potentially handcuffs, and there were traces of adhesive around her mouth. And she was linked to Cottingham after he was arrested.
Okay. Now, the next case is pretty interesting as well.
The next case is very interesting. This one's, in my mind, where it shows his sadistic and devious ways.
His true depravity.
Yeah, just kind of how he will do what it takes not to get caught.
Right.
Yes, and the next victim we had was Didi Gaddardzi. She was found with a Jane Doe, teen Jane Doe, who to this day still hasn't been identified. And they were both killed in 1979.
So Didi was a sex worker. That's important to point out. And the relation between Didi and Jane Doe being a sex worker is probably spot on. I mean, they don't have evidence that Jane Doe was also a sex worker, but I'm going to make that leap.
Right. Potentially she was. No one's been able to identify her or anything like that. So, but there's a reason as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, firemen responded to an alarm at the Travel Inn Motel near Times Square. Inside, they found Didi and the Jane Doe.
Mm-hmm.
However, their heads and hands were removed. So they were severed off, and they were not there.
How bloody was that crime scene?
It honestly depends. It depends on when the victims were deceased. If they were strangled before they died, less so, because their heart would stop pumping, in which I do believe happened because his MO was to strangle his victim. So I believe they were both strangled, they were died, they were killed.
Mm-hmm.
Cottingham later even confessed that he cut their hands off and their head off because he was seen the night before with Didi at a bar.
Okay.
And before we move on here, the bodies were also lit on fire. So they're doused with lighter fluid and set on fire.
Okay. So we're definitely seeing some signs that Cottingham is starting to lose the plot here. He is starting to be afraid that maybe the cops he's too hot and they're going to pick up his lead, his scent. So he's trying to cover his tracks. Something that we haven't seen from him in the past.
Right. So the fact that he was seen at a bar the night before shows that he didn't plan this out. It was like an impulsive decision he made the next day. Mm-hmm. So he probably was with them the night before, with them that day, or they slept over, and things got too far, and he couldn't control himself, and then he had to find a way to cover his tracks.
So Didi was a mom. Her daughter actually got adopted at age 4, and years later she found out that she was adopted, the little girl, and went to try to track down her birth mom. And she discovered that Didi was one of Cottingham's victims, and she wrote to the serial killer, the torso killer. And in the past several years, she's visited him almost 40 times.
His demeanor is laid back and it's not threatening. And he looks like a jolly old Santa.
Yeah, and I also think that's a strange dynamic that...
I do too.
I understand it's not... It's your biological mother, however, and you didn't have a relationship, but it's a weird dynamic. They actually have photos of them hugging and like smiling together and being close. Mm-hmm. And I do understand that many of the confessions that came forward was because of her daughter, because of her convincing and talking to...
Telling him, I forgive you.
Right.
Yeah.
And we would love to know you guys' opinion on that as well, if you want to leave a comment, because we personally found it a little strange. However, we're not in that situation, and we don't have to deal with it. Maybe it was her only way of coping with things. Or
could be very selfless decision on her part,
right,
to go in and try to open the dialogue, because like you said, they credit her with getting him to talk and reveal some information that the cops were never able to extract from him during those interviews.
Right, so what she did was very important to getting some closure for the other victims' families.
But how damaging would that be to another person if they were in her situation? Would you be able to rise above and do it in the name of helping others, or would you just live with it and just be, I'm done with this, man? I'd much rather not ever finding out that this happened to my mom. I wonder if a part of her wishes that she'd never explored and learn who her birth mom was.
Right.
Because that's a lot to carry with you.
Of course.
Huge responsibility.
And I don't think I could. I think I'd rather know less details, as much as I would be curious, morbidly curious, but I would rather not know the information. And I would
think
stay
so
away.
too. I have to agree. I think so too. I'd much rather imagine my mom living happily somewhere else,
right,
under a false name or something. Maybe she went into witness protection, and to protect me, she had to leave me behind or something like that. That's the story I would make up.
Yeah, something to maybe paint her as a hero.
Yes, to paint her as a hero.
Absolutely. So let's get into the next two victims. The last two victims. Valerie Streets. She was found deceased May 5th, 1980. She was 19 years old. So she was found in the Quality Inn's Hasbrook Heights in New Jersey, the same place as Marion Carr, who we mentioned earlier. She had bruises. She was bitten around her head, body, and breast. Her handcuffs were placed behind her back with adhesive tape over her mouth. She suffocated to death, and she died. She was discovered by a housekeeper. This is the only case that they were able to lift any sort of evidence other than DNA, which at the time they couldn't connect to him from the crime scene, and that was one single fingerprint.
So he's spiraling out of control at this point. He goes back to the same motel that he killed?
Yeah, the same motel. And
okay,
let
so
me go
he's
back here.
frequent there.
Almost becoming comfortable in a way, / sloppy. So he's not getting creative or trying to find new ways. He's just going to what's working for him, what he hasn't been caught for yet. And this is in a very, very important place because it will lead to how he was caught. So keep this place in mind, as 2 victims were already found, the second time by housekeepers.
And we also have a fingerprint.
And we found a fingerprint.
Okay.
Which at the time, they weren't able to connect to him.
So let's talk about the crime scene a little bit. When you go on a crime scene like this, and you see a victim that fits a profile, and you're working a serial case, what are some of the evidence that you start collecting right off the bat?
So
what do you focus on?
The first thing you really need to look for in a case where you believe it to be serial in nature is some sort of signature or something that
connects the two? Or
something that
connects them?
Yeah, connects them, that the serial killer keeps doing. Let's say they always bite the left breast, or they always scratch the back, or they always do something, or they always handcuff him behind the back and do something strange or something that sticks out to you. Or you see some sort of object was moved, or everything is precise. So you need to find indications of similarities between these so that you can then share with other communities to identify which crime scenes are connected so that you can use both for evidential purposes.
Okay.
All right, let's get into the last known victim, which is Jean Rayner. She was found May 15th, which is 10 days after Valerie Streets. So May 15th, 1980. She was found strangled with her throat cut at a different hotel. Cottingham severed her breast and posted them on the headboard of the bed and set fire to the mattress and left. So this is the second time that we know of that he used some sort of fire. This is the first time that he's actually severed a body part and placed it within the hotel. And this is the first time that we know that he's cut somebody's throat.
Okay, so he's kind of completely becoming unraveled. There's no cooling period. The police already know or could build a profile of him that he frequents motels, he favors sex workers, he is violent, sadistic. So maybe they're putting more officers on the streets to frequent these neighborhoods.
Right.
To be on the lookout. Maybe the word is on the street between sex workers.
Yeah, so he's definitely in a situation where just killing somebody is no longer giving him pleasure. He has to go to a more advanced torturing or making the victim suffer
that's
more.
That's a good point, yeah.
And that's how he is now finding gratification. He hasn't been caught. He's been doing it.
And doing it.
And he needs to find something more to please him.
Not only that, but the time frames are getting shorter.
Right.
And shorter.
So if we go into how he was arrested, it was actually only 7 days later.
Okay.
So May 5th, Valerie Streets. May 15th, Jean Rayner. So those two are 10 days apart. And then now he has May 22nd. So he picked up Leslie Odell, who was a sex worker, and she was working the street of Lexington Ave and 25th Street.
In New York City.
Yes. So she agreed to have sex for $100.
That's a lot of money back in 1980.
Yes, that's a good amount of money. 18 days late after Valerie Street's body was found, in the same hotel, he brings Odell back to that same...
So potentially this is going to be his third victim in that same motel?
Yes, so Valerie Streets, Marion Carr, and potentially this individual.
He's completely
Leslie.
reckless at this point.
Yes, and it was 18 days later. It's the Hasbrook Heights Quality Inn. So she was found dead 18 days ago.
Mm-hmm.
He killed somebody in between, and now he's bringing another street worker back to that same hotel.
And the hotel was never shut down by authorities?
Or something. I don't understand why they wouldn't have... Maybe they did. Maybe they had directed patrols or something of that sort on every single hotel, because word obviously would have gotten out. There would be fear in families, and women walking the street or their children or anything like that. So
unless that hotel was, famous with turning bodies up left and right, then there was just the usual scene there.
Yeah, I'm sure it wasn't an up class. I've never been there. I'm sure you never either. But I'm sure it wasn't up class. I'm sure it was a place where you could rent a couple hours at a time. But still.
2 murders and it's still open?
2 murders in 3 years. It should have been A, shut down, or B, required to do some sort of security measures better than what they were doing.
Well, they're still in business, and our favorite serial killer
yeah, if you're looking for a spot,
is bringing another victim.
So going back to the story, Leslie was offered a massage by Cottingham, and she accepted. Obviously, she's getting paid to do something, so what's a massage going to hurt?
Wow, very gentleman-like of him.
Yeah, surprisingly, I suppose. But either way, when she turned around, he pulled out a knife and handcuffed her hand behind her back. Again, this is what he would do, because you're more vulnerable with your hand behind your back than if they're up front. So he began torturing her and nearly biting her nipples off. So I didn't mention earlier, her mouth was also duct taped, yes. So
he was going about his ritual.
What he always did in the way of apprehending them and controlling them and restraining them.
And being sadistic.
Yes. So he was starting the process, absolutely. He was biting her almost to where her nipples would be severed off. So
interesting. There was no sex involved.
Not yet. And like we mentioned in the first episode, sadism is not about the sex act. It's about pain and torturing is what gives them gratification. I'm sure sex does as well, but I think it was more about torturing at this point and control. But Leslie later testifies that Cottingham said, "You have to take it. The other girls did. You have to take it too. You're a whore, and you have to be punished."
Okay.
So it sounds to me like he developed a
hatred
and it appears to me that he developed some sort of coping mechanism, as sadistic as it sounds, to
explain to himself the murders, justifies the murder.
To justify himself in murdering these sex workers, which absolutely makes no sense, especially that he would kill and abduct teenage girls.
I don't think it made sense to him, too. I think that's a very easy cop-out.
Just something that he would say during it,
yeah.
So then staff begin hearing Odell's muffled cries.
Oh, finally!
And of course, only 18 days later, I'm sure they were on the lookout for such acts. And they called the police. So the police arrived. They demanded he open the door and arrested him right there in the hallway. So found on Cottingham were handcuffs, a leather gag, 2 slave collars, a switchblade knife, a replica pistol. So a replica can't fire. So it looks like a real gun, but it can't fire. And then a stockpile of prescription pills.
All right, so when we talk about being caught red-handed, we can definitely say Richard Cottingham got caught red-handed. Absolutely.
No questions, if or ands about it. And the stockpile of prescription pills is very interesting to me.
Well, it was the 70s and the 80s, I think. I think prescriptions are handed out like candy.
No, I agree, but a stockpile means a bunch. I don't know if he was using them for himself or if he would try to use it on his victims to...
Well, that explains being able to subdue 2 victims at a time.
Right, to subdue them, to kind of get them unaware of what's going on and just more relaxed.
And being around sex workers, I hate to support that stereotype, but a lot of them have drug habits. So if you say, hey, you're getting paid, you're getting high for free, then probably it was easy for them to go along and follow his lead.
Right, absolutely. So following the arrest, inside his residence, there was a locked room.
His house?
Of his house.
Mm-hmm.
And his trunk. They found personal effects of two of the victims. So we'll call them his trophies from the incidents he would take and he would hide. My question is, having a locked room in a house where your spouse can't go or anything like that sounds...
bonkers.
Yeah, like a huge red flag. Obviously, at this point, she's filed for divorce. She took it back maybe because he threatened her or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But...
The horror that wife and children lived in with Richard Cottingham, it must have been a nightmare. I
would say so. And I would believe that as his killings progressed and torturing, that he would become more controlling and abusive at home as well.
So what would be some of the first things the police will do with the torso killer once he is apprehended?
So as soon as possible, you would take him back to the station. He's clearly a high-profile case. You know that there are other victims out there. You believe there to be other victims out there. So you would do everything by the books.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so you would bring him back. Excuse me, let me first start. You would photograph him there. What he's wearing, what he looks like, everything like that. Bring him back to the station. And then you would take everything. His clothes, his pants, his boots, his underwear. If he has a watch, if he has any sort of jewelry, you take everything. And that way you can get some sort of samples that may connect him to the scene. Nowadays, if you would do it, you would take samples from underneath his fingernails. You would obviously get a warrant for his blood if he didn't consent.
DNA.
Yes, excuse me. A warrant for his DNA if he doesn't consent. His boot prints. His fingerprints, which they had an active one from the last scene.
So they right away can at least pin one murder on him.
Right. And they want to limit the media exposure so that you just put him into a cell. But you have to give him his custodial rights. So let him make his phone call, but make sure you're there to listen to who he's calling and what is being said.
Right.
Then, as soon as possible, you move to interrogation. And that way you can lock him into a story. In a situation like this, I don't believe he would talk very much because he was, as you mentioned, caught red-handed. So he can't really wiggle his way out of anything.
Mm-hmm.
He can use a classic, there was somebody else there and he left, or something like that. But nothing indicated that...
But his victim is alive and will testify.
Right, so nothing indicates that he would find a way to wiggle out. So I don't believe he would have testified. Excuse me, I don't believe that he would have spoken to police at that time.
All right, so fast forward, 40 years? Richard Cottingham is now 75 years old. He is in prison serving consecutive life sentences.
Right.
And we come to find another case that we can link to him, probably the oldest DNA to ever be tested from a cold case, Dianne Cusick. He pleaded not guilty to that, by the way.
Did he really?
He did, yes.
The audacity. Before you continue, as we mentioned, they like to relive the moments. I believe that he probably pleaded not guilty. For one, it gets him out of the cell. He goes back and forth to court, sees new people, talks to new people. But for two, I think he wanted to relive it. He wanted people to bring up, or these attorneys to bring up the evidence, and so that he can relive the moment.
I was watching the news clips, and I thought the same thing.
Yeah,
I thought, why strung it along? The evidence is there.
Even
the MO is there.
Right.
I was able to be in the same space as Diane's daughter, who never gave up looking for her mom's killer. She was very happy that police never gave up that they continue to work the case, and that DNA technology has advanced as much as it has to test DNA that it's 40 years old is unbelievable.
Right, absolutely. As we mentioned before, this was DNA that they got not knowing it could be tested in the future. They were taking it for other purposes, or
they saved it for this long,
or hoping that one day it could be tested.
I mean, the detectives who worked the case, Dianne's case, they long ago retired and whatnot. But when the case was renewed and they began to reinvestigate it, they contacted the initial detectives, and they were able to recall details and help out as much as they could. So it always stays with in the mind of the detective.
This is a case you don't forget.
Yeah, it is a case you don't forget.
You go to, or as a police officer, you go to thousands of calls a year. Many of them you don't remember, but there are some that you'll remember every single detail. You remember who you talked to, their names, their first names, even their social security numbers. It's strange.
It's interesting to know because the New Jersey police has now submitted 5 more cold cases for retesting and testing, whatnot, that they hope will be linked to Richard Cottingham, the torso killer, aka the Times Square killer. It will be interesting in the near future, hopefully, if we're able to pin more murders on him. And that draws the conclusion to our podcast today. We talked about Richard Cottingham, the torso killer, aka the Times Square killer. Did he really kill 80 to 100 women? Well, we don't know. But we hope that any woman out there that is still a Jane Doe will find peace, and police will be able to find them and link them to Richard Cottingham. Until next time, I'm Jolene Grace.
And I'm Branden. Thank you for joining.